Hey there, welcome to Whispers of RPG. Today, we're diving into one of the most jaw-dropping moments in RPG history, a night that changed everything, where kingdoms fell, gods clashed, and the world was never the same again. Get ready to hear all about epic battles, powerful betrayals, and the unstoppable fights for control that shaped a whole era. So grab a snack, get cozy, and let's jump into this thrilling story that every RPG fan has been waiting for. Ours, Chapter 1, The Golden Age Before the Fall. Before we can understand the horror of the Shattering, we must first appreciate the majesty of what was lost. The lands between under Queen Marika, the Eternal's rule, had experienced what scholars would later call the Golden Age of the Erd Tree. This was an era of unprecedented prosperity, where the golden light of the great tree reached every corner of the realm, bringing order, life, and divine grace to all who dwelt beneath its boughs. Queen Marika, the Eternal, stood at the center of this golden empire, not merely as a ruler, but as a living goddess. She was the vessel of the Elden Ring, that cosmic symbol of order that gave structure to reality itself. Through her divine authority, the laws of existence were written and enforced. Death was held at bay, banished, and sealed away so that those blessed by grace could live in eternal service to the Golden Order. The very concept of mortality had been conquered, or so it seemed. Under Marika's reign, the greater will, that cosmic force from beyond the stars, had found the perfect vessel through which to impose its vision of order upon the world. The tree, massive beyond comprehension, stretched toward the heavens like a golden spear piercing the sky. Its roots delved deep into the earth, spreading the influence of the Golden Order to every corner of the lands between. From these roots, the blessed would return upon death, reborn in eternal service to the divine hierarchy that Marika had established. The architecture of this golden age was magnificent to behold. Lendl, the royal capital, rose like a crown of gold and marble beneath the Ur's protective embrace. Its towers and ramparts gleamed with divine light, while the streets bustled with merchants, nobles, and clergy, all united in their devotion to the Golden Order. The very stones of the city seemed to hum with sacred power, blessed by proximity to the world's most holy site. But this golden empire was not born from peaceful expansion alone. It had been forged in the crucible of conquest, shaped by the iron will of Marika's first elder lord, Godfrey. Known in his earlier days as Huaru, this barbarian king had been chosen by Marika to lead her armies in a great crusade to establish the Golden Order's dominion over all opposition. The wars of expansion had been brutal and decisive. Godfrey's forces, led by his crucible knights, had swept across the lands between like a golden tide. They had broken the armies of the fire giants in the frozen peaks of the mountaintops, slaying their fell god, and ensuring that the flame of ruin could never again threaten the tree. They had driven the ancient dragons from their seats of power, forcing even the mighty dragon lord plus Saxes to retreat to his place beyond time. In the underground realms, Godfrey's warriors had battled the omens and other creatures that the Golden Order deemed impure. The conquered peoples were offered a simple choice: embrace the grace of the Erd tree or face annihilation. Many chose submission, finding places within the new order as soldiers, craftsmen, or servants. Others resisted to the bitter end, their names and deeds lost to history as the golden narrative overwrote their stories. The nobility of the Golden Age lived lives of opulent splendor. The descendants of Marika and Godfrey, the golden lineage, ruled over vast estates and commanded armies of devoted followers. Godwyn the Golden, firstborn of the royal house, embodied all the virtues that the Golden Order proclaimed. He was beautiful, noble, and beloved by all who knew him. In battle, he was without peer, having defeated even the mighty ancient dragons in single combat. In peace, he was wise and just, earning the love of nobles and commoners alike. Yet beneath this golden surface, cracks had already begun to form. The very perfection of the Golden Order contained the seeds of its own destruction. In banishing death, Marika had upset the natural balance of existence. Those who live in death, shambling undead creatures that should not exist in a world where mortality had been conquered, began to appear with increasing frequency. These abominations were signs that something fundamental was wrong with the cosmic order. The omen children born with cursed horns and bestial features represented another flaw in the golden design. Even within Mura's own family, these imperfections manifested. 2 of her sons with Godfrey Moog and Morgott were born as omen. Their existence, a living contradiction to the Golden Order's claims of divine perfection. They were hidden away, their very existence deemed shameful by a regime that preached the inherent superiority of those touched by grace. Religious dissent also simmered beneath the surface. While the Golden Order demanded absolute faith in the greater will and its earthly representative, other beliefs persisted in the shadows. The merchants, descendants of a nomadic people, whispered of the flame of frenzy, a chaotic force that promised to burn away all distinctions and reduce the world to primordial unity. Their music, played on instruments of bone and hide, carried melodies that spoke of older, wilder times before the golden light imposed its sterile order. In the academy of Raya Lucaria, the glintstone sorcerers pursued knowledge that sometimes conflicted with Golden Order doctrine. Their study of the stars and the cosmic forces beyond revealed truths that challenged the supremacy of the greater will. Though nominally allied with the Golden Order through political marriage, the Academy remained a bastion of intellectual independence that could potentially threaten the regime's monopoly on truth. The nobility itself was not immune to internal strife. Ancient bloodlines nursed grudges against the golden lineage, seeing them as upstarts who had seized power through conquest rather than inheritance. Regional governors chafed under the central authority of Landel, dreaming of the days when their ancestors ruled as independent kings and queens. Ambitious generals and administrators looked with envious eyes upon the wealth and privilege enjoyed by those closest to the throne. Most ominously, even within the royal family itself, tensions were beginning to emerge. As Godfrey's campaigns of conquest reached their inevitable conclusion, with all external enemies either defeated or cowed into submission, his usefulness to Ma's grand design began to WNE. The very qualities that made him invaluable as a conqueror, his savage strength, his bloodthirsty nature, his warrior's code, became liabilities in a world that increasingly demanded administrators rather than warriors. The signs of Godfrey's decline were subtle at first. Those who knew him well noticed that the fire had dimmed in his eyes, that same fierce light that had once driven him to victory after victory. He had conquered all there was to conquer, and without enemies to fight, the great warrior found himself adrift. His regent beast, Sash, that lion-like creature that had helped temper his savage nature during his reign, could sense the growing restlessness in its host. Meanwhile, across the realm in Liurnia of the Lakes, a new figure was rising to prominence. Radahn, a red-haired champion of the Golden Order, had emerged as a military leader of exceptional skill and devotion. His campaigns against the Karen royal family and their sorceress allies had established him as a worthy successor to Godfrey's legacy of conquest. But unlike the barbarian king, Radahn possessed a scholar's mind alongside a warrior's strength, making him equally at home studying incantations as wielding weapons in battle. The marriage between Radahn and Rinnal, Queen of the Full Moon, had been both a diplomatic triumph and a personal victory. Through this union, the Golden Order had achieved what military force alone could not: the complete integration of Leia into America's empire. The Academy of Rey Lucaria, once a potential rival to the Golden Order's authority, now served as an allied institution. Its sorcerers working alongside the Order's clergy to advance the cause of cosmic law and order. From this marriage came 3 children who would play crucial roles in the coming catastrophe. Ree, born with the potential to become an Empyrean like her stepmother Marika, possessed power that could reshape the very foundations of existence. Radahn, who would grow to become perhaps the mightiest warrior of his generation, learned to command both blade and gravity magic with equal skill. Rykard, brilliant and ambitious, would eventually preside over the volcanic fortress of Mount Galmire, where he would conduct experiments that pushed the boundaries of acceptable knowledge. As Godfrey's star waned, Radahnn's rose ever higher. The red-haired champion's loyalty to the Golden Order was absolute, his faith in the greater will unshakable. Where Godfrey had been a weapon to be pointed at enemies, Radahn was a true believer who could advance the cause of order through conviction as much as conquest. It became increasingly clear to those with eyes to see that a changing of the guard was inevitable. The transition, when it came, was handled with the surgical precision that marked all of Ma's political maneuvering. Godfrey and his warriors were stripped of their grace. The divine blessing that had sustained them through decades of service. Banished from the lands between, they were forced to wander the wastelands beyond, becoming the first of the Tarnished. The official explanation was that their purpose had been fulfilled, that conquerors were no longer needed in an age of consolidation and growth. Radagon's return to Lindell and his elevation to the position of second Elden Lord was presented as a natural continuation of the Golden Order's evolution. His marriage to Ma united two of the realm's most powerful figures, creating a partnership that seemed destined to usher in an even greater age of prosperity and divine favor. The birth of their twin children, Michaela and Millennia, was hailed as a sign of the gods' continued blessing upon the royal house. Yet, even these blessed twins bore signs of the cosmic imbalance that plagued the Golden Order. Michaela, despite his divine nature, remained trapped in the body of a child, unable to grow or mature as nature intended. Millennia, though possessed of martial prowess that rivaled even Radahn's, was afflicted with the scarlet rot, a supernatural disease that slowly consumed her flesh and threatened to spread to all she touched. These curses were omens of greater troubles to come, signs that even the gods were not immune to the flaws inherent in their created order. The Golden Age, for all its magnificence, was built upon contradictions that could not be sustained indefinitely. The banishment of death had created unnatural conditions that spawned abominations. The concentration of power in the hands of demigods had created potential rivals for ultimate authority. The suppression of competing ideologies had driven opposition underground, where it festered and grew in the darkness. Most critically, the very success of the Golden Order had eliminated the external threats that once united its desperate factions in common cause. As the decades passed, the initial enthusiasm that had driven the Golden Order's expansion began to fade. The generation that had witnessed the great conquests gave way to their children and grandchildren, who knew only peace and prosperity. Without the crucible of conflict to forge unity, the various factions within the empire began to pursue their own agendas. Regional governors accumulated power and resources, building private armies ostensibly for defense, but capable of offense if circumstances required. The demigod children of America each powerful beyond mortal comprehension, began to develop their own spheres of influence. Godwyn the Golden, as the eldest and most beloved, naturally assumed a position of leadership among his siblings and half-siblings, but the others were not content to remain in his shadow indefinitely. Radahn built his reputation as the strongest of the demigods, learning gravity magic to enhance his already formidable martial prowess. Rykard accumulated forbidden knowledge and built a following among those who chafed under the restrictions of Golden Order orthodoxy. Perhaps most significantly, Rai had begun to question the very foundations upon which her stepmother's empire rested. As an Empyrean, she possessed the potential to become a god in her own right, to reshape the cosmic order according to her own vision. The prospect of eternal servitude to the Two Fingers and their alien agenda filled her with revulsion. In the depths of her study, surrounded by scrolls and star charts, she began to formulate plans that would eventually shake the heavens themselves. The signs of coming catastrophe were there for those with wisdom to see them. Storms gathered more frequently around the Erd tree, as if the cosmic forces were growing restless. The those who live in death appeared with increasing regularity. Their shambling forms a mockery of the Golden Order's promise of eternal life. Strange new stars appeared in the night sky, their alien light visible even through the golden radiance of the world tree. In the depths of the royal capital, ancient prophecies spoke of a time of testing when the foundations of order would be shaken, and the strong would claim dominion over the weak. These prophecies had been largely forgotten during the long peace, dismissed as the ravings of primitive minds that could not comprehend the eternal stability that the Golden Order had achieved. But a few scholars hidden away in dusty libraries and forgotten archives continued to study these dire predictions and saw in current events the fulfillment of long dormant fears. The merchants, ever sensitive to the currents of change, began to alter their traditional routes. Caravans that had once traveled openly along the king's roads now moved in secret, following hidden paths known only to their kind. Their music, that haunting melody that spoke of chaos and flame, grew more prevalent in taverns and inns, though always played softly, and ceased immediately whenever representatives of authority appeared. Even the tree itself seemed to sense the approaching storm. Its golden light, once steady and unchanging, began to flicker with subtle variations that troubled those few who maintained the vigil of observation. The sap that flowed from its bark, normally sweet and nourishing, developed a bitter undertone that made the sacred wine less palatable to those who partook of it in religious ceremonies. In the underground depths beneath the capital, where the roots of the Erd tree delved deepest into the earth, strange sounds could sometimes be heard echoing through the tunnels. Workers who descended into these sacred spaces spoke in whispers of distant weeping, of voices that called out names in languages that had been forgotten since before the Golden Order's rise to power. The priests dismissed these reports as hallucinations brought on by the sacred vapors that rose from the tree's roots. But the frequency of such accounts grew troubling. The nobility, insulated by their wealth and privilege from the concerns of common folk, remained largely oblivious to these warning signs. Their lives continued to revolve around the endless cycle of court politics, social gatherings, and ceremonial obligations that marked their elevated status. Yet even among their ranks, a few astute observers began to note subtle changes in behavior. Conversations that once flowed freely now carried undercurrents of tension. Old alliances seemed less reliable, while new partnerships formed along lines that would have seemed impossible only years before. As the calendar marked the passage of another year in the Golden Age's seeming eternity, few could have imagined that they were living through the final peaceful season of their civilization. The shattering, when it came, would arrive with the sudden violence of a lightning strike, transforming the ordered world they knew into a nightmare of war and chaos that would endure for generations. But before we witnessed that terrible night that changed everything, we must understand the key figures whose actions would determine the fate of the lands between. For the Shattering was not simply a war between armies, but a conflict between gods and demigods, each driven by their own vision of what the world should become. Chapter 2: The Players in the Game of Gods. Understanding the Shattering requires intimate knowledge of the extraordinary beings whose ambitions and conflicts would tear an empire apart. These were not mere mortals squabbling over territory or treasure, but demigods whose very existence reshaped the world around them. Each possessed power beyond imagination, yet each was also driven by very human emotions: love, hatred, ambition, despair, and the desperate desire to leave a mark upon eternity. At the center of this divine drama stood Queen Marika, the Eternal herself, the goddess whose actions would serve as the catalyst for everything that followed. To understand Marika is to grapple with one of the most complex and contradictory figures in all of gaming law. She was simultaneously the architect of the Golden Order's greatest triumphs and the instrument of its ultimate destruction. A being of such divine power that she could reshape reality itself, yet so tormented by loss that she would choose to shatter the very foundation of existence rather than continue living within its constraints. Ma's origins lay shrouded in mystery, though fragments of her past can be glimpsed in the shadows cast by ancient events. She was new men, one of a race that originated from beyond the lands between, beings possessed of lifespans that stretched across centuries and potential that could reshape the cosmic order itself. How she came to be chosen as an Empyrean, a candidate for godhood capable of serving as a vessel for the greater will's influence, remains a subject of scholarly debate. What is known is that her ascension to divine status came at tremendous cost. The Golden Order's establishment required the suppression of competing powers, the subjugation of ancient races, and the imposition of an artificial hierarchy that elevated order above all other values. Ma had proven willing to pay any price for power, crushing the fire giants and stealing their flame. Banishing the concept of death itself and rewriting the fundamental laws that governed existence. Yet beneath her divine authority and cosmic power, America remained haunted by the consequences of her choices. The children she bore were touched by curses that even her godhood could not prevent or cure. Her beloved son, Godwyn, would grow to embody all the virtues of the Golden Order. But the twins she bore with her second husband would suffer afflictions that served as constant reminders of the unnatural world she had created. Perhaps most remarkably, Ma herself was not a singular being, but rather two aspects of the same divine consciousness. The revelation that she and Radahn were the same entity capable of manifesting as separate individuals while sharing fundamental identity represents one of the most profound mysteries in the entire narrative. This duality would prove crucial to understanding both her motivations and the internal conflicts that would eventually drive her to shatter the Elden Ring itself. Radahn, her masculine aspect, embodied unwavering loyalty to the greater will and absolute faith in the Golden Order's righteousness. Where America might question or doubt, Radahn remained steadfast in his devotion. This internal division created a tension at the very heart of the divine hierarchy, a cosmic schizophrenia that would eventually manifest in the most destructive way possible. Godwyn the Golden stood as perhaps the most tragic figure in this pantheon of gods and demigods. As America's firstborn son with Godfrey, he represented everything the Golden Order claimed to embody. His beauty was legendary, described in terms that suggested divine perfection, made manifest in physical form. His nobility of character earned him love and respect from all who knew him, from the mightiest lords to the humblest servants. His prowess in battle was unmatched, proven in single combat against foes that would have challenged entire armies. But Godwyn's greatest strength was also his fatal weakness. His very perfection made him a symbol of the Golden Order's legitimacy, and symbols by their nature become targets for those who would challenge what they represent. His death would not merely eliminate a powerful rival. It would strike at the heart of everything the Golden Order claimed to be eternal and unassailable. The relationship between Godwyn and his younger siblings was complex, marked by both genuine affection and the inevitable tensions that arise when multiple heirs possess power that could reshape the world. By all accounts, Godwyn bore his status as eldest son and heir apparent with grace, never flaunting his position or treating his siblings with anything less than respect and kindness. Yet his very existence served as a constant reminder to the others of their secondary status in the succession. Miquella, the unhallowed, presented, perhaps, the most poignant contradiction among Ma's children. Blessed with wisdom and charisma that could sway even the most hardened hearts, he possessed the potential to become the greatest leader of his generation. His understanding of the cosmic forces that shaped reality exceeded even that of many older and more experienced scholars. His compassion for the suffering of others drove him to seek solutions to problems that had plagued the world since the Golden Order's inception. Yet, Miquella remained trapped in the body of a child, unable to grow or mature despite the passage of years. This curse rendered him vulnerable in ways that his divine power could not overcome. Dependent upon others for protection and support, the irony of a being capable of understanding the deepest mysteries of existence, being helpless to change his own fundamental nature, served as a constant source of frustration and sorrow. His love for his twin sister, Malenia, represented one of the few pure and uncomplicated relationships in a family marked by rivalry and hidden agendas. Their bond transcended the political calculations that shaped most interactions among the demigods, based instead on mutual understanding and shared suffering. Both bore curses that marked them as different from their siblings, creating a connection that would endure even through the horrors of the Shattering. Malenia, Blade of Miquella, embodied the concept of strength through adversity in ways that would have been impossible to imagine in a purely human context. The scarlet rot that consumed her flesh would have been a death sentence for any mortal. But her divine nature allowed her to not merely survive, but to transform her affliction into a weapon of terrifying power. Her mastery of swordsmanship reached levels that bordered on the supernatural, each movement precise and deadly enough to cut down multiple foes in a single strike. Her devotion to Miquella went beyond simple sibling affection, approaching the realm of religious worship. She saw in her brother a vision of what the world could become under enlightened leadership, free from the rigid hierarchies and arbitrary cruelties that marked the Golden Order's rule. This devotion would drive her to commit acts of violence and destruction that contradicted her brother's message of compassion, creating a tragic irony that would haunt both of them. The rot that plagued Malenia also made her a weapon of mass destruction, whose very presence could transform entire regions into hellscapes of disease and death. Her control over this power was incomplete, making her dangerous, even to those she sought to protect. The knowledge that she carried within herself, the potential to destroy everything she held dear, created a constant tension that would eventually contribute to the catastrophic events at Khalid. Radahn, known as the Star Scourge, represented the pinnacle of martial prowess among the demigods. His physical strength was legendary, even by the standards of divine beings, requiring him to learn gravity magic, simply to continue riding his beloved horse, Leonard, without crushing the creature beneath his weight. His mastery of both blade and sorcery made him a formidable opponent in any form of combat, equally capable of devastating foes with crushing physical attacks or cosmic forces that could level entire armies. But Radahn's true claim to fame lay in his ongoing battle against the very stars themselves. Through his gravitational magic, he held back the movement of celestial bodies that threatened the lands between with cosmic catastrophe. This constant vigilance required tremendous concentration and energy, making him as much a guardian as a warrior. His willingness to sacrifice his own comfort and freedom for the protection of others earned him respect even from those who might otherwise oppose him. The relationship between Radahn and his father Radahn was marked by genuine pride and affection. Rare emotions in a family where political calculations usually trumped personal feelings. Radahn had taught his son that true strength came not from domination over others, but from the discipline to use power responsibly. This lesson would shape Radahn's approach to both war and peace, making him one of the few demigods who commanded loyalty through inspiration rather than fear. Rykard, who would eventually become known as the Lord of Blasphemy, began his career as one of the most promising members of his generation. His intellect rivaled that of Miquella, while his understanding of the cosmic forces that shaped reality exceeded even Radahn's considerable knowledge. As Preto of the Golden Order, he wielded judicial authority with wisdom and fairness, earning a reputation as one of the few figures in the government who could not be swayed by political pressure or personal gain. Yet Rykard's very intelligence and perceptiveness would prove to be his downfall. The more he learned about the true nature of the Golden Order and the Greater Will's agenda, the more he came to question whether the current system truly served the best interests of the lands between inhabitants. His studies led him down paths of knowledge that the orthodox authorities considered forbidden, bringing him into contact with powers and entities that existed outside the approved cosmic hierarchy. The transformation that would eventually consume Rykard began subtly with small compromises and minor transgressions that seemed justified by the greater good they might achieve. But each step down this path made the next one easier, until he found himself embracing blasphemies that would have horrified his younger self. His ultimate fusion with the Great Serpent represented not just a physical transformation, but a complete rejection of everything he had once stood for. Rai the Witch, born as Lunar Princess Rai, possessed perhaps the most dangerous combination of attributes among all the demigods. The power of an Empyrean, the intellect of a master sorcerer, and the will to challenge the cosmic order itself. Unlike her siblings, who largely accepted their roles within the existing hierarchy, Ranni questioned the fundamental assumptions upon which their world was built. Her study of the stars and the forces beyond revealed truths that few others were willing to acknowledge. Her relationship with her stepmother, Ma, was complex, marked by both genuine respect and fundamental philosophical disagreement. Rai understood that Marika had achieved godhood at tremendous personal cost, but she rejected the idea that this justified the suffering imposed upon countless others. Her vision of an alternative future, one where the lands between could exist free from the influence of outer gods and their manipulative servants, would drive her to commit acts that many would consider unforgivable. The path that led Rai to orchestrate the Night of Black Knives was not one of simple rebellion or personal ambition. Rather, it emerged from her growing understanding that the current cosmic order was fundamentally unsustainable. The greater will's influence corrupted everything it touched, turning even well-intentioned leaders into instruments of oppression. Only by breaking the cycle entirely could the lands between hope to achieve true freedom. Moog, Lord of Blood, represented the dark mirror of his twin brother, Morgott's noble sacrifice. Where Morgott chose to defend the very system that had rejected him, Moog embraced his status as an outsider and sought to build an alternative power structure based on the rejection of Golden Order values. His discovery of the Formless Mother, an outer god that promised power to those willing to embrace blood and sacrifice, provided him with both the means and the justification for his rebellion. The dynasty that Marg built in the underground depths beneath Ka represented a complete inversion of Golden Order principles. Where the surface world preached order and hierarchy, the Mogwyn dynasty celebrated chaos and transformation. Where the Erd tree promised eternal life through service, the Formless Mother offered power through blood sacrifice and the embrace of forbidden desires. Moog's obsession with his half-brother Miquela was not merely political, but deeply personal. He saw in the eternally youthful demigod a kindred spirit, another being trapped by circumstances beyond his control. His plan to force Miquela into godhood so that they could rule together as consorts revealed the depth of his isolation and his desperate desire for meaningful connection. Morgott, known to most as Margaret, the fell omen, before his true identity was revealed, embodied perhaps the most tragic loyalty in the entire saga. Despite being born as an omen, rejected by the very society he would spend his life defending, he never wavered in his devotion to the Golden Order and his mother, Queen Marika. His willingness to serve as the guardian of Lindell standing against all who would claim the throne, demonstrated a nobility of spirit that put many of his more blessed siblings to shame. The internal conflict that Morgott must have experienced, defending a system that viewed his very existence as an abomination, speaks to depths of character that few could comprehend. His knowledge that he would never be accepted as a legitimate heir, combined with his absolute conviction that the Golden Order represented the best hope for peace and stability, created a contradiction that he resolved through pure force of will. His battles against the other demigods during the Shattering were particularly painful, as he was forced to stand against siblings and half-siblings who might otherwise have been natural allies. Each victory came at the cost of family bonds that could never be repaired. Yet, he never hesitated when duty called. His eventual defeat at the hands of a Tarnished, one of the very exiles he had spent his life opposing, represented the final irony in a life marked by service to those who would never truly accept him. These then were the principal actors in the drama that would unfold across the lands between. Each possessed power that could reshape reality. Yet each was also bound by limitations and contradictions that would ultimately prove their undoing. Their conflicts were not merely political, but deeply personal, rooted in family dynamics that had been shaped by centuries of divine politics and cosmic responsibility. The stage was set for catastrophe, with players whose very nature made peaceful resolution impossible. When the crisis came, it would not be resolved through negotiation or compromise, but through violence on a scale that would leave scars visible for generations. The Shattering would reveal the true character of each participant, stripping away the facades and pretenses that had maintained the illusion of unity during the peaceful years. Music, Chapter 3. The night that changed everything. On a winter evening, when fog rolled thick across the lands between, covering the golden light of the tree in a shroud of gray mist, the course of history was forever altered. This was the night of Black Knives, an event so shocking in its audacity and devastating in its consequences that it would serve as the catalyst for everything that followed. What transpired in those dark hours would shatter not merely the life of one beloved prince, but the very foundations of divine order itself. The conspiracy that unfolded on that fateful night had been months, perhaps years in the planning. It required a level of coordination and secrecy that could only have been achieved by someone with intimate knowledge of the royal family's routines and access to powers that existed outside the Golden Order's protective embrace. The Black Knife assassins who carried out the deed were no common cutthroats, but elite warriors whose very existence had been carefully hidden from the authorities. These assassins were all women, new men like Queen Marika herself, science of the eternal cities who had mastered arts of stealth and combat that made them nearly unstoppable when properly motivated. Their armor was crafted to make no sound, their movement so fluid and precise that they could pass through guarded halls like shadows made manifest. But what made them truly dangerous were the weapons they carried. Black knives that had been imbued with a fragment of the rune of death itself. The theft of this fragment from Marika, America's loyal shadow and guardian of destined death, represented a violation of cosmic law so profound that its very possibility should have been inconceivable. Malek had bound the rune of death within his own flesh, making himself a living seal that protected the world from the return of mortality. Yet somehow, through arts both subtle and blasphemous, a piece of this ultimate power had been stolen and refined into weapons capable of killing even the immortal. The ritual that transformed these ordinary daggers into God's slaying weapons was performed by Rai herself, using knowledge that she had gained through her study of forbidden texts and her communication with forces that existed beyond the greater wills. Influence. The incantations required were ancient beyond measure, their words carrying echoes of power that predated the Erdree's golden age. To speak them was to invite cosmic retribution, yet Rai did so willingly, understanding that some prices were worth paying for freedom. The timing of the attack was not random, but carefully calculated to achieve maximum psychological impact. Godwyn the Golden was not merely the eldest son of the royal house, but the living symbol of everything the Golden Order claimed to represent. His death would not simply eliminate a potential rival for power, but would prove that even the most blessed and protected of the demigods were vulnerable to mortal weapons wielded by determined foes. The assassins approached their target through routes that had been scouted and planned with military precision. They moved through the royal capital like ghosts, their concealing veils rendering them effectively invisible to the guards and sentries who should have detected their presence. The protective wards and magical barriers that surrounded the royal quarters, defenses that had been crafted by the greatest sorcerers and blessed by the most powerful priests, proved as ineffective as morning mist against their advance. Finding Godwyn required intimate knowledge of his habits and preferences. Information that could only have come from someone with access to the most private areas of the royal family's residence. Whether this intelligence was provided by a willing collaborator or obtained through more subtle means remains a matter of speculation, but its accuracy was evident in the success of the mission. The confrontation itself was brief but decisive. Godwyn, for all his legendary martial prowess, was not prepared for an attack by multiple foes wielding weapons that could bypass his divine protections. The black knife assassins struck with coordinated precision, restraining the Golden Prince, while their leader, Tish, delivered the fatal blow that carved the curse mark of death into his flesh. The death that claimed Godwyn was unlike any that had occurred since the establishment of the Golden Order. Because destined death had been removed from the world, mortality had become an alien concept, something that existed only in ancient texts and half-remembered legends. When the Black Knives struck, they did not simply end Godwyn's life in the conventional sense, but rather split his very existence in a way that violated the fundamental laws of reality. The curse mark of death that was carved into Godwyn's flesh should have formed a complete circle, a symbol of the cosmic wheel that governs all existence. But at the precise moment of his death, another soul perished simultaneously, causing the mark to fracture into two incomplete halves. This other death was Rai's own, a carefully orchestrated suicide that she performed using the same ritual that empowered the assassin's weapons. Rai's death was not an accident or an unintended consequence, but a calculated sacrifice designed to achieve a specific goal. As an Empyrean, she possessed the potential to become a god. But this blessing came with the terrible price of eternal servitude to the Two Fingers and their cosmic agenda. By dying in body while preserving her soul, she could escape this fate while retaining enough of her power to continue pursuing her own objectives. The splitting of the curse mark had consequences that neither Rai nor anyone else could have fully anticipated. Godwyn's soul was destroyed while his body lived on, transforming him into the first of those who live in death. His physical form, interred in the depths beneath the tree, began to mutate and spread like a cancer through the tree's root system. What had once been the most beautiful of the demigods became a source of corruption that would plague the lands between for generations to come. The immediate aftermath of the assassination was chaos. The discovery of Godwyn's body sent shock waves through the royal capital that could be felt in every corner of the realm. The Golden Prince, beloved by all who knew him, lay dead in a manner that should have been impossible. The very fact of his death challenged every assumption upon which the Golden Order's authority rested. The Black Knife assassins did not escape unscathed from their mission. As they fled through the streets of Lendl, they were pursued by guards and soldiers who had finally been alerted to the catastrophe that had occurred. In the running battle that followed, several of the assassins were killed or wounded, including Tish herself, who died protecting her mother, Alto, the leader of the group. The capture of some of the assassins provided the authorities with their first clues about the true scope of the conspiracy. Under interrogation, they revealed nothing about their ultimate master, but their very existence raised troubling questions. The fact that they were new men, the same race as Queen Marika herself, suggested connections that reached into the highest levels of the government. Their weapons clearly imbued with fragments of destined death indicated access to powers that should have been beyond mortal reach. News of the assassinations spread across the lands between with supernatural speed, carried by ravens and riders who bore the terrible tidings to every corner of the realm. In distant keeps and isolated villages, people who had never seen Godwyn the Golden wept openly at the news of his death. He had been more than just a prince to them. He had been a symbol of hope, a proof that the Golden Order's promises were not empty lies. The psychological impact of Godwyn's death extended far beyond simple grief. For the first time since the establishment of the Golden Order, the common people were forced to confront the reality that even the gods could die. The immortality that had been promised to the faithful suddenly seemed less certain, while the cosmic hierarchy that placed the demigods above ordinary mortals appeared more fragile than anyone had imagined. Queen Marika's reaction to her son's death was immediate and devastating. According to those who witnessed her in the hours following the discovery of Godwyn's body, the goddess, who had maintained perfect composure through centuries of rule, was consumed by a rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. The golden light that normally emanated from her divine presence flickered and twisted, taking on hues that spoke of fury and despair beyond mortal comprehension. In her grief and anger, Ma made a decision that would echo through the ages. Using the same hammer with which she had forged the Elden Ring, she shattered the cosmic symbol that had given structure and meaning to existence itself. The act was not one of careful deliberation, but of pure emotional release. A mother's scream of anguish given form through divine power. The moment the Elder Ring broke, reality itself convulsed. The golden light that had blessed the lands between for centuries dimmed and flickered, while the laws that governed existence became unstable and unreliable. Magic that had once been predictable became chaotic, while creatures and phenomena that had been held in check by cosmic order suddenly found themselves free to roam and multiply. Radahn, Marika's other self, immediately attempted to repair what she had destroyed. Using the same hammer that had shattered the ring, he tried desperately to piece together the fragments and restore the cosmic order that had given meaning to his existence. But the damage was too great. The fragments too scattered and corrupted by the violence of their breaking. His efforts, though heroic in their persistence, were doomed to failure from the beginning. The Greater Will's response to Ma's act of cosmic vandalism was swift and merciless. The entity that had elevated her to godhood and used her as its vessel for imposing order upon the world could not tolerate such open rebellion. Ma was imprisoned within the tree itself, her divine body crucified upon a rune-carved framework that would hold her until the end of time, or until someone with sufficient power chose to challenge the cosmic hierarchy directly. The punishment extended beyond mere imprisonment. the greater will withdraw its active support from the Golden Order, leaving the various institutions and hierarchies that had depended upon divine backing to fend for themselves. The grace that had blessed the faithful became inconsistent and unreliable, while the protection that had shielded the realm from external threats began to weaken and fail. The shattering of the Elden Ring had one final crucial consequence: the creation of the Great Runes. These fragments of cosmic power, each containing a portion of the original ring's authority, scattered across the lands between like seeds of chaos. They were drawn to those with the strength and ambition to claim them. The demigod children of Ma, who possessed the divine nature necessary to bear such tremendous power. Each great rune that found a new bearer transformed both the holder and their domain in ways that reflected their fundamental nature. Godric's fragment enhanced his ability to graft the strength of others onto himself, turning his desperate hunger for power into a supernatural compulsion. Radahn's rune amplified his already formidable strength, while binding him more tightly to his role as protector of the realm. Melania's fragment, tainted by her affliction with scarlet rot, became a source of both healing and disease that would prove to be a double-edged blessing. The immediate political consequences of these events were profound. With Ma imprisoned and her designated heir dead, the succession to the throne became an open question for the first time in centuries. The various demigods, each now empowered by their possession of great runes, found themselves in positions where they could realistically claim the right to rule. But the great runes came with a terrible price. The fragments of cosmic power were inherently corrupting, filling their bearers with ambitions and desires that grew beyond all reasonable bounds. The demigods, who had once been content to serve the Golden Order as loyal princes and princesses, now found themselves consumed with visions of personal empire and divine authority. The transformation was not immediate, but gradual. A slow poisoning of noble intentions that turned family bonds into political calculations and reduced loving siblings to potential rivals. The great runes whispered to their bearers of the power they could wield, the changes they could make, the wrongs they could right, if only they possessed sufficient authority to act without constraint. As word of the Night of Black Knives spread throughout the realm, local governors and military commanders found themselves facing impossible choices. Their oaths of loyalty had been sworn to Queen Marika and the Golden Order she represented, but with the goddess imprisoned and the cosmic hierarchy in chaos, the meaning of those oaths became unclear. Some chose to maintain their allegiance to the established order, whatever its current difficulties. Others saw opportunity in the confusion and began to position themselves for the conflicts they sensed were coming. The common people, lacking the political sophistication to understand the full implications of what had occurred, simply knew that their world had changed in ways that filled them with dread. The golden light that had blessed their lives for generations now seemed uncertain and unreliable. Strange creatures began to appear in places where they had never been seen before, while familiar landscapes took on sinister aspects that spoke of corruption and decay. Music in the underground cities and hidden settlements where dissident and outcasts had gathered over the centuries. The news of Godwyn's death and the Elden Ring's shattering was received with emotions that ranged from jubilation to terror. Some saw in these events the beginning of the Golden Order's long overdue collapse, the first cracks in a system that had oppressed them for generations. Others understood that the chaos to come would likely consume the innocent along with the guilty, bringing suffering to all, regardless of their political allegiances. The Knight of Black Knives had achieved exactly what its architect had intended: the complete destabilization of the cosmic order that had governed the lands between for centuries. But like all acts of revolutionary violence, it had also unleashed forces that could not be controlled or directed by any single will, no matter how powerful or determined. The stage was now set for the greatest civil war in the history of the lands between. A conflict that would pit God against God, brother against sister, and ideal against ideal, in a struggle that would leave the entire realm transformed beyond recognition. The shattering had begun not with the clash of armies or the siege of cities, but with a single act of violence that proved even the immortal could die. The die had been cast, and now all that remained was to see how they would fall. Chapter 4: The Breaking of Bonds. In the weeks and months following the Night of Black Knives, the lands between experienced a transformation that went far beyond the immediate political crisis. The shattering of the Elden Ring had created not just a succession dispute, but a fundamental breakdown in the cosmic order that had governed reality for centuries. As the great runes found their way to their destined bearers, the delicate balance of power that had maintained peace began to collapse with accelerating momentum. The Demigods, who had once stood united as siblings and step-siblings, now found themselves possessed by fragments of cosmic power that amplified their individual natures while poisoning their relationships with those they had once loved. The great runes were not merely sources of strength, but also seeds of corruption that grew more potent with each passing day. What had begun as minor disagreements over policy and precedents gradually evolved into fundamental conflicts over the future of civilization itself. Godric the Grafted was perhaps the first to succumb completely to the corrupting influence of his great rune. Already insecure about his position within the golden lineage, he had always felt overshadowed by his more accomplished relatives. The power that now flowed through him promised a solution to his feelings of inadequacy. but only if he was willing to pay an increasingly steep price for each enhancement. The practice of grafting, which had begun as a desperate attempt to strengthen himself through incorporating the body parts of fallen enemies, evolved into an obsession that consumed every aspect of his existence. His castle at Stormville became a channel house where prisoners and volunteers alike were subjected to surgical procedures that violated every principle of mercy and human dignity. The Golden Prince, who had once been known for his courtesy and learning, transformed into a monster whose very appearance became a source of revulsion and terror. But Godric's transformation was not merely physical. The great rune that empowered his grafting abilities also corrupted his mind, filling him with grandiose delusions about his own importance and destiny. He began to see himself not as the weakest of the demigods, but as their natural leader, the one who would unite all their strengths within his own enhanced form. This delusion would drive him to acts of increasing audacity and violence, as he sought to claim the power he believed was rightfully his. The other demigods watched Godric's descent into madness with a mixture of horror and calculation. Some, like Morgott, saw in his transformation a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition. Others, like Mog, viewed his corruption as proof that the old moral constraints were no longer relevant in a world where cosmic law had broken down. But all of them understood that his example demonstrated the kind of power that was now available to those willing to embrace it fully. Radahn's response to the crisis was characteristically direct and noble, at least initially. As the mightiest warrior among the demigods, he felt a responsibility to maintain order and protect the innocent during the turbulent times that followed the Elden Ring's destruction. His mastery of gravity magic, which he had originally developed to avoid crushing his beloved horse, Leonard, now became a tool for holding back cosmic forces that threatened to overwhelm the world entirely. The feat for which Radahn would be most remembered, his arrest of the movement of the stars themselves, was not an act of conquest, but of protection. The celestial bodies whose orbits had been regulated by the Elder Ring's cosmic authority now moved chaotically through the heavens, threatening to bring down meteors and other stellar catastrophes upon the inhabited lands below. Through sheer force of will and magical power, Ron held them in place, sacrificing his own freedom and comfort to serve as a living barrier against cosmic destruction. But this act of selfless heroism came at a tremendous personal cost. The constant concentration required to maintain his gravitational hold on the stars left Radahn with little mental energy for other pursuits. He became increasingly isolated from his family and followers, spending long hours in solitary meditation as he struggled to maintain the cosmic barriers that protected the world. The cheerful, gregarious prince who had once been beloved for his warmth and humor, gradually withdrew into himself, becoming a distant figure whose thoughts were always focused on threats that only he could perceive. The isolation that Radahn's noble sacrifice required also made him vulnerable to influences that he might otherwise have resisted. The great rune that empowered his already formidable strength also whispered to him of greater glories that could be achieved if he were willing to abandon his protective duties. The temptation to use his power for conquest rather than protection grew stronger with each passing day, though he continued to resist it through sheer force of will. Malenia's struggles with her affliction took on new dimensions in the changed world that followed the Shattering. The scarlet rot that had always plagued her body now seemed to respond to the cosmic chaos, growing more virulent and aggressive as the natural barriers that had once contained it weakened and failed. Her control over the disease became increasingly tenuous, forcing her to isolate herself from others to prevent the spread of corruption. The great rune that Malenia inherited was supposed to be the most sacred of all the fragments, but her affliction with scarlet rot had corrupted it in ways that made its power as much curse as blessing. The enhanced healing abilities it granted came at the cost of making her an even more potent vector for the spread of disease. Every battle she fought now carried the risk of transforming the battlefield into a wasteland of rot and decay. Her devotion to her brother, Miquella, provided the only stable anchor in a life that was otherwise consumed by suffering and isolation. She had sworn to be his blade, his protector, and his avenger. And this oath gave meaning to her existence, even as her affliction made normal relationships impossible. But even this bond, pure as it was, became a source of tension as other demigods began to view Miquella's growing influence with suspicion and alarm. The relationship between Malenia and Radahn, which had once been marked by mutual respect between two mighty warriors, began to sour as their respective burdens drove them toward opposing positions. Radahn's protective isolation made him appear aloof and uncaring to others who were struggling with their own problems, while Malenia's dangerous affliction made her seem like a threat to the stability that Radahn was trying to preserve. Miquella himself represented perhaps the most tragic figure in this pantheon of suffering gods. His wisdom and compassion, which should have made him a natural leader during these troubled times, were constrained by his curse of eternal childhood. The body that trapped him prevented others from taking him seriously as a potential ruler, while his genuine desire to help often came across as naive idealism to those hardened by years of political maneuvering. The solutions that Miquella developed for the problems plaguing the lands between were often brilliant in their conception, but impossible to implement without the kind of authority that his cursed form denied him. His unalloyed gold needles which could halt the progression of outer god corruption, represented a breakthrough that could have saved countless lives if he had possessed the political power to distribute them widely. His cultivation of the hick tree as an alternative to the corrupted tree showed vision and determination that surpassed that of his older siblings. But Miquella's very virtues made him a target for those who saw in his purity either a threat to their own ambitions or an opportunity to be exploited. His inability to defend himself physically despite his divine nature made him dependent upon others for protection. This dependence created relationships that were inherently unequal and therefore unstable, as even well-intentioned guardians might develop their own agendas for how his power should be used. The growing tension between Miquella's followers and the adherents of other demigods created a series of cascading conflicts that made peaceful resolution increasingly unlikely. Each side viewed the others with suspicion, seeing in their rivals' actions evidence of plots and conspiracies that might or might not have actually existed. The paranoia that characterized this period was not entirely unjustified, as real conspiracies did exist alongside imagined ones, making it impossible for anyone to trust anyone else completely. Rykard's transformation from respected jurist to blasphemous serpent lord represented perhaps the most dramatic example of how the post-Shattering world corrupted even the noblest intentions. His initial experiments with forbidden knowledge had been motivated by a genuine desire to find solutions to problems that conventional wisdom could not address. The legal system he had administered as Tor had been marked by fairness and integrity, earning him respect even from those who disagreed with his decisions. But the forbidden knowledge that Ryk pursued came with a price that he had not fully understood when he began his studies. Each revelation about the true nature of cosmic order required him to abandon more of the moral constraints that had once guided his actions. The serpent that he eventually allowed to devour him was not just a physical entity, but a manifestation of the hunger for power that had grown within him. As his understanding of reality's malleable nature expanded, the volcano manor that Rykard established as his seat of power became a gathering place for all those who had been cast out or rejected by the Golden Order. Exiles, criminals, and dissident found welcome there, united by their shared resentment of the system that had failed them. But this fellowship of the dispossessed was built on negative foundations, united by what they opposed rather than what they hoped to build. The blasphemous experiments that Rykard conducted in his volcanic fortress pushed the boundaries of acceptable knowledge far beyond anything that had been attempted during the Golden Order's reign. His efforts to understand and manipulate the fundamental forces of existence yielded insights that were both profound and terrible. The power he gained through these studies came at the cost of his humanity, transforming him into something that could no longer be considered either god or mortal. Rai's role in initiating the crisis through the Night of Black Knives placed her in a unique position during the conflicts that followed. Unlike her siblings, who had inherited their great runes as a consequence of the Shattering, she had deliberately orchestrated the events that created the current situation. Her rejection of her own great rune was both a philosophical statement and a practical necessity, as accepting that power would have bound her to the same cosmic forces she was trying to escape. The path that Rai had chosen required her to operate in shadows and through intermediaries, as her apparent death during the Night of Black Knives had freed her from the expectations and obligations that constrained her siblings. Her new form, inhabiting a doll crafted in the image of her mentor, allowed her to pursue her agenda without the political baggage that came with her royal heritage. But Rai's freedom came at the cost of isolation and the constant threat of discovery. The allies she recruited to her cause, including the loyal Night Bled and the giant blacksmith Eeg, provided essential support, but also created vulnerabilities that her enemies could exploit. The complex web of relationships and obligations that her plans required made her dependent upon others in ways that she could not fully control. The ultimate goal that drove Rai's machinations, the creation of an age of stars that would free the lands between from the influence of all outer gods, was so radical in its implications that few could fully comprehend what she was attempting to achieve. Her vision of a world governed by natural law rather than divine mandate represented a fundamental challenge to every assumption upon which civilization had been built for millennia. Moog's embrace of the formless mother and the bloody dynasty he established in the underground depths represented the darkest possible response to the Golden Order's collapse, where other demigods sought to reform or replace the existing system. Moog chose to create something entirely new, built upon principles that inverted everything the surface world claimed to value. The blood magic that Moog practiced was not merely a different form of power, but a complete rejection of the life-affirming principles that had once governed cosmic order. His rituals required constant sacrifice and suffering, creating a system that could only sustain itself through the exploitation of others. The dynasty he built attracted those who had been broken by the surface world's failures, offering them power and purpose in exchange for their willingness to embrace corruption. The abduction of Miquella from his protective cocoon at the Hickory represented the culmination of Moog's plans, but also revealed the fundamental flaw in his approach. His desire to force Miquella into godhood so that they could rule together as consorts showed that even in his corruption, he retained enough of his original nature to crave genuine connection and acceptance. But the methods he employed to achieve this goal ensure that any relationship built upon them would be fundamentally unhealthy and unsustainable. Morgott's position during this period was perhaps the most psychologically complex of all the demigods. His unwavering loyalty to the Golden Order, despite being born as an omen that the system rejected, created internal tensions that would have driven lesser beings to madness. His decision to serve as the guardian of Lindell, defending the throne from all claimants, including his own siblings, demonstrated a nobility of spirit that transcended personal grievance. But Morgott's loyalty also blinded him to the legitimate criticisms of the system he defended. His refusal to acknowledge the Golden Order's failures and injustices made it impossible for him to serve as a bridge between the various factions that might otherwise have found common ground. His characterization of his siblings as willful traitors reflected his inability to understand that their rebellions might be motivated by genuine principles rather than simple ambition. The isolation that Morgott's position required was profound and tragic. Rejected by the surface world for his omen nature, but unable to join the underground communities that might have accepted him due to his political allegiances, he existed in a liminal space between worlds. His use of the identity Margaret, the fell omen, allowed him to interact with others without revealing his true status. But this deception also prevented him from forming genuine relationships. As these various transformations and conflicts developed, the ordinary people of the lands between found themselves caught between forces they could neither understand nor control. The stability and prosperity they had known during the Golden Age evaporated as their divine protectors became consumed with personal struggles that made their subjects' welfare increasingly irrelevant. The breakdown of central authority created opportunities for local strong men and ambitious nobles to carve out their own domains, often through methods that would have been unthinkable during the height of the Golden Order's power. Banditry and piracy flourished as the military forces that had once maintained order were recalled to serve in the private armies of competing demigods. The economic systems that had sustained trade and commerce for centuries began to collapse as the roads became too dangerous for ordinary travelers, and the currency systems lost the backing of stable governmental authority. Communities that had prospered through their connections to larger markets found themselves isolated and struggling to survive on their own resources. Perhaps most troubling of all, the magical and technological innovations that had made the Golden Age's prosperity possible began to fail as the cosmic forces that powered them became unstable. The minor Eries that had provided healing and blessing to local communities withered and died, while the magical barriers that protected settlements from dangerous creatures weakened and failed. The stage was now set for open warfare, on a scale that the lands between had not seen since the original wars of conquest that established the Golden Order. The bonds of family, loyalty, and shared purpose that had once held the realm together had been thoroughly shattered, replaced by ambitions and grudges that could only be resolved through violence. The shattering was about to begin in earnest, and when it did, the conflicts would make the Night of Black Knives seem like a gentle prelude to the symphony of destruction that was to come. Chapter 5. The war begins. The transition from political crisis to open warfare was not sudden, but gradual, marked by a series of increasingly bold provocations and responses that finally crossed the line from diplomatic maneuvering to military action. The Demigods, each now empowered by their great runes and driven by ambitions that grew more grandiose with each passing day, found themselves unable to coexist within the framework of the old order. What had begun as family disagreements escalated into conflicts that would reshape the very geography of the lands between. The first major break occurred when a coalition of the great rune bearers attempted to establish what they called the Sovereign Alliance. This confederacy was intended to provide a framework for shared governance in the absence of clear central authority, with each demigod maintaining sovereignty over their own domain, while cooperating on matters of mutual concern. The proposal seemed reasonable on its surface, offering a path towards stability that might have prevented the worst of what was to come. But the alliance was doomed from the start by the fundamental incompatibility of its members' visions for the future. Morgott insisted that any legitimate government must operate under the authority of the Golden Order and in service to Queen Marika, even in her imprisoned state. Radahn demanded that the protection of the realm from cosmic threats take precedence over all other considerations. Miquela advocated for reforms that would address the systemic inequalities that had led to the current crisis. The negotiations that surrounded the alliance's formation revealed just how far apart the various factions had grown in their fundamental assumptions about justice, authority, and the proper ordering of society. Each side approached the discussions with proposals that seemed perfectly reasonable from their own perspective, but utterly unacceptable to their rivals. Compromise became impossible when the participants could not even agree on basic questions of fact about what had caused the current crisis. The breaking point came when evidence emerged suggesting that several members of the alliance were secretly building up their military forces while publicly negotiating for peace. Weapon stockpiles discovered in supposedly neutral territories, recruitment drives conducted under false pretenses, and the movement of troops under cover of diplomatic missions created an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that made continued cooperation impossible. the formal dissolution of the Sovereign Alliance was announced through a series of increasingly hostile proclamations that made clear each faction's determination to pursue their own agenda, regardless of the consequences for others. The diplomatic language that had characterized earlier exchanges gave way to open accusations of treachery, blasphemy, and betrayal that left no room for future reconciliation. The first actual battle of the Shattering was fought not between the major demigods, but between their followers, as competing factions of knights and soldiers clashed over control of strategic resources. The engagement at Khaled's border, where Radahn's Redmine forces encountered troops flying Godric's banner, was relatively small in scale, but enormous in its implications. The sight of Golden Order soldiers fighting against each other in organized formation marked the complete breakdown of the military hierarchy that had maintained peace for centuries. The reports that reached the various demigod courts about this initial skirmish revealed disturbing truths about how thoroughly the old loyalties had dissolved. Soldiers who had served together for decades found themselves on opposite sides of battle lines, their oaths to the Golden Order creating obligations that now contradicted each other. The personal relationships that had once transcended political differences proved inadequate to prevent violence when the fundamental legitimacy of authority itself became a matter of dispute. Godric's response to these early clashes demonstrated both his growing megalomania and his strategic incompetence. Rather than consolidating his position and building alliances that might have given him a chance of ultimate victory, he chose to immediately escalate the conflict by declaring himself the rightful heir to the throne and demanding that all other claimants submit to his authority. This grandiose gesture succeeded only in uniting his rivals against him, while revealing his own weaknesses to potential allies. The siege of Stormville Castle, though ultimately unsuccessful, established the template for much of what would follow during the Shattering. Multiple armies converged on a single strategic target, but their lack of coordination and competing objectives prevented any of them from achieving decisive victory. Instead, the various forces found themselves locked in a grinding campaign of attrition that consumed enormous resources while producing minimal strategic gains. The horror of what warfare between demigods could produce became apparent during the early battles around Stormville. Soldiers empowered by fragment of divine grace clashed with weapons and magic that could reshape the battlefield itself. The very landscape bore the scars of their conflicts, with entire hillsides melted by supernatural fire and valleys flooded when magical barriers failed catastrophically. The civilian population caught in these war zones faced suffering on a scale that had been unimaginable during the peaceful years of the Golden Age. Entire communities were evacuated or destroyed, as the expanding conflicts made ordinary life impossible. The refugees who fled the battle zones brought with them stories of horrors that challenged the understanding of those who had never witnessed demigod combat firsthand. Perhaps most disturbing were the reports of how the great runes were affecting their bearers during actual combat. The fragments of cosmic power seemed to respond to the stress and violence of battle. By amplifying their holders' abilities in ways that pushed them beyond the boundaries of sanity and self-control, warriors who had once been known for their discipline and restraint were transformed into berserkers whose rage could only be satisfied by total destruction of their enemies. Radahn's participation in these early battles revealed both his military genius and the personal cost of his ongoing struggle to maintain cosmic stability. His gravitational magic, employed as a weapon rather than a protective tool, could literally tear apart enemy formations by manipulating the fundamental forces that held matter together. But each use of his power for destructive purposes seemed to weaken his control over the stellar barriers that protected the world from cosmic catastrophe. The psychological impact of fighting against Radahn was unlike anything most soldiers had experienced. His ability to manipulate gravity meant that conventional tactics and weapons became useless, while his sheer physical presence on the battlefield created terror that could break even veteran formations. The sight of the giant warrior riding into battle on his tiny horse, his massive form defying the laws of physics through pure magical power, became a symbol of the new reality where normal rules no longer applied. But Radahn's effectiveness as a military commander was undermined by his unwillingness to pursue victory at any cost. His nobility of character, which would have been an asset during peacetime, became a liability in conflicts where his enemies showed no similar restraint. His refusal to target civilian populations or employ the most destructive applications of his power gave his opponents advantages that more ruthless leaders would never have allowed. The early phases of the Shattering also revealed the extent to which Rhi had been preparing for this conflict through her network of agents and allies. The sudden appearance of well-equipped forces flying her banner in battles across the realm demonstrated that her apparent death during the Night of Black Knives had been part of a larger strategy rather than a desperate gambit. The troops that fought under Rand's command operated with a level of coordination and intelligence that suggested access to information that other factions lacked. Their ability to appear in unexpected locations and disappear before enemy reinforcements could arrive indicated either supernatural mobility or advanced knowledge of their opponent's plans. The psychological effect of fighting against an enemy whose leader was supposedly dead created additional complications for military commanders trying to develop effective counter strategies. Rand's forces also employed weapons and tactics that violated the conventional understanding of how warfare should be conducted. Their use of night raids, assassinations, and sabotage reflected their leader origins in the underground world of conspiracy and revolution. The honor codes that still governed most demigod armies, even in the midst of civil war, seemed irrelevant to fighters who had been trained to achieve victory through any means necessary. The revelation that many of Rand's most effective agents were spirits and undead creatures controlled through sorcery added a supernatural element to conflicts that had previously been fought between living beings. The sight of skeletal warriors and ghostly knights fighting alongside human soldiers challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of death and the proper relationship between the living and the dead. As the scope of the conflict expanded, each faction began to develop specializations that reflected their leaders' particular strengths and obsessions. Godric's forces became notorious for their willingness to employ captured enemies in grotesque grafting experiments, creating hybrid warriors whose enhanced abilities came at the cost of their basic humanity. The propaganda value of these abominations was as important as their military effectiveness. As the sight of former comrades transformed into monsters served to break enemy morale, the territories controlled by Mog became sources of blood magic practitioners, whose abilities grew more powerful with each enemy they killed. The rituals that sustained these warriors required constant human sacrifice, creating a military system that could only expand through conquest and the enslavement of defeated populations. The sight of Mog's blood-soaked banners became a signal for immediate evacuation among civilian populations who understood what their approach meant. Miquella's forces, by contrast, employed healing magic and defensive strategies that minimized casualties on both sides while achieving their strategic objectives. The unalloyed gold needles that his followers carried could halt the progression of various supernatural afflictions, making them invaluable allies for troops facing enemies who employed curse magic or disease weapons. But their reluctance to pursue total victory, even when circumstances favored them, often allowed dangerous enemies to escape and regroup. The logistics of sustaining these various armies revealed another dimension of how the Shattering was transforming the lands between. The traditional supply systems that had supported the Golden Order's military forces during their wars of conquest were no longer adequate for conflicts where multiple factions competed for the same resources. The breakdown of trade networks and the conversion of agricultural land into battlefields created shortages that affected both military effectiveness and civilian survival. Each faction developed its own solutions to these logistical challenges, solutions that often reflected their leaders' moral character as much as their strategic thinking. Godric's forces simply took what they needed from conquered territories, using their grafting abilities to enhance their soldiers' capacity for violence against anyone who resisted. Radahn's armies maintained the disciplined supply systems of the old Golden Order military. But this approach limited their operational flexibility and made them dependent upon secure base areas. Moog's blood cult developed the most sinister solution to the supply problem by incorporating cannibalism and blood magic into their standard operating procedures. Their ability to sustain themselves through consuming their enemies meant that they could operate in hostile territory indefinitely. But this advantage came at the cost of making them increasingly inhuman with each victory. The psychological transformation that resulted from such practices created warriors who were effective in battle, but incapable of returning to normal life, even if peace was somehow restored. The naval dimension of the Shattering opened up new theaters of conflict as the various factions sought to control the waterways that connected the different regions of the lands between. The lakes and rivers that had once served as peaceful trade routes became contested zones where floating fortresses and magical vessels clashed in battles that could be seen from miles away. Renala's forces, drawing upon the academy of Raya Lucaria's mastery of glintstone sorcery, developed floating platforms and energy weapons that gave them significant advantages in naval combat. Their ability to manipulate gravity and project force at long distances made traditional warships obsolete, forcing other factions to develop new tactics or avoid water-based operations entirely. The transformation of Liurnia's lakes into a magical battlefield had devastating effects on the local ecosystem and the communities that depended upon it for survival. Fish and other aquatic life died en masse when exposed to the magical energies released during naval battles, while the water itself became contaminated with substances that made it dangerous to drink or use for irrigation. As the war expanded and intensified, each faction began to recruit allies from among the non-human inhabitants of the lands between. The ancient dragons, who had remained largely neutral during the political crises that preceded open warfare, found themselves courted by multiple sides, seeking to gain access to their devastating combat abilities and ancient wisdom. Some dragons chose to ally themselves with factions whose goals aligned with their own interests, while others remained stubbornly independent, viewing the conflicts between demigods as temporary disturbances that would eventually resolve themselves. The sight of ancient dragons fighting on opposite sides of the same battle represented a profound change in the cosmic order. As these beings had not been involved in large-scale warfare since their original defeat during the Golden Order's rise to power, the recruitment of omen warriors created another source of complexity in the expanding conflict. These cursed beings who had been marginalized and persecuted during the Golden Age now found themselves valued as soldiers by factions desperate for any advantage they could gain. Their natural resilience and supernatural abilities made them formidable fighters, but their integration into conventional military units created logistical and social challenges that commanders struggled to address. The underground cities and settlements that had served as refugees for dissident and outcasts during the Golden Age became crucial strategic assets during the Shattering. Control of these hidden communities provided access to secret tunnels, weapon caches, and intelligence networks that could determine the outcome of surface battles. The fighting that erupted in these subterranean spaces was particularly brutal, as the confined environments made large-scale tactics impossible, while amplifying the destructive potential of individual combatants. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of these underground battles was their impact on the civilian populations who had sought refuge in these hidden places. Communities that had survived persecution and marginalization during the Golden Age found themselves caught between competing armies whose conflicts they had no stake in resolving. The safe havens that had preserved alternative ways of life for generations were transformed into battlegrounds where survival depended more on military value than moral worth. The role of magic in the Shattering evolved rapidly as the various factions experimented with new applications of power that would have been forbidden during the Golden Order's reign. The breakdown of central authority meant that the restrictions on dangerous or blasphemous magic were no longer enforced, allowing practitioners to pursue research that pushed the boundaries of what was possible or advisable. Reichard's experiments with serpent magic and blasphemous knowledge produced weapons and techniques that horrified even hardened warriors. His ability to transform defeated enemies into serpentine creatures under his control created psychological weapons as much as military ones, as the sight of former comrades serving their killer broke the morale of opposing forces. The Volcano Manor's research into forbidden magic also yielded insights into the fundamental nature of reality that had implications far beyond military applications. Ricard's understanding of how cosmic law could be manipulated or violated provided him with advantages that went beyond simple magical power, allowing him to operate according to rules that his enemies could not predict or counter. But the pursuit of forbidden knowledge came with prices that became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. Reichard's transformation into something that was neither human nor divine was only the most visible manifestation of corruptions that affected all who delved too deeply into powers that were meant to remain hidden. The servants and followers who supported his research found themselves changed in ways that made return to normal life impossible. Bound to their master, not just by loyalty, but by the fundamental alterations that his magic had wrought upon their very essence. The impact of the shattering on the natural world became increasingly severe as the conflicts escalated and spread. The magical energies released during battles between demigods created environmental changes that persisted long after the armies had moved on to other theaters of war. Forests withered and died when exposed to curse magic, while lakes and rivers changed color and composition after being contaminated with blood magic or rot-based weapons. Perhaps most disturbing were the reports of new life forms emerging in areas where particularly intense magical battles had been fought. These creatures, neither wholly natural nor entirely artificial, possessed abilities that made them dangerous to all living beings, regardless of their political allegiances. The sight of former battlefields transformed into alien landscapes where conventional life could not survive served as a constant reminder of the true cost of the ongoing conflicts. The weather patterns across the lands between began to change as the cosmic disruptions caused by the war affected the fundamental forces that governed natural phenomena. Storms became more frequent and violent, while areas that had enjoyed temperate climates for centuries found themselves subject to extremes of heat and cold that made agriculture difficult or impossible. The breakdown of the seasonal cycles that had governed agricultural life for millennia created food shortages that affected all populations regardless of their political affiliations. The armies that consumed vast quantities of supplies were fed at the expense of civilian communities who found themselves struggling to survive on increasingly meager rations. As the first year of open warfare drew to a close, it became apparent that none of the major factions possessed the strength to achieve decisive victory over their rivals. The great runes that empowered each demigod made them individually formidable, but also created a balance of power that prevented any single leader from accumulating enough strength to dominate all others. This stalemate was not the result of any conscious strategy or agreement, but rather the inevitable consequence of having multiple players with roughly equivalent power competing for the same ultimate prize. Each faction possessed advantages that made them dangerous to their enemies, but also weaknesses that prevented them from achieving total victory. The realization that the war might continue indefinitely created new dynamics within each faction as supporters began to question whether their sacrifices were achieving any meaningful results. The initial enthusiasm that had driven many to support their chosen leaders gave way to warwa weariness and growing skepticism about the possibility of achieving the better world that had been promised. some military commanders began to explore possibilities for localized trusses or prisoner exchanges that might reduce the suffering without requiring their superiors to abandon their ultimate objectives. These unofficial arrangements, negotiated between field officers who had grown tired of pointless slaughter, represented cracks in the rigid hostility that characterized the official positions of the various factions. But such initiatives were often undermined by the intervention of the demigods themselves, whose possession of the great runes made them increasingly unable to accept compromise or acknowledge the legitimacy of their rivals' positions. The cosmic power that flowed through them seemed to demand absolute victory, making partial solutions appear to be betrayals of their divine destiny. The stage was now set for the next phase of the Shattering, as the various factions began to realize that conventional warfare alone would not be sufficient to achieve their goals. The conflicts that had begun with familiar patterns of siege and battle would soon evolve into something far more terrible, as each side sought new ways to break the stalemate that threatened to consume the lands between entirely. Chapter 6: The Great Campaigns. As the Shattering entered its second year, the nature of the conflict began to change in ways that reflected both the growing desperation of the participants and their increasing willingness to employ methods that would have been unthinkable during the earlier stages of the war. The realization that no quick victory was possible forced each faction to develop long-term strategies that accepted the reality of extended conflict while seeking decisive advantages through bold gambles and unprecedented tactics. The first defense of Lendel marked a crucial turning point in the character of the Shattering, as it represented the first major attempt by the rebel factions to strike directly at the heart of the Golden Order's remaining authority. The coalition that assembled to assault the royal capital included forces from multiple demigod factions, united temporarily by their shared goal of breaking Morgoth's stubborn defense of the throne. The siege of Lendel revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the coalition strategy that several rebel factions had adopted. Their combined armies represented a force that was probably capable of overwhelming Morgoth's defenses through sheer weight of numbers and concentrated firepower. But the coordination required to maintain such a diverse alliance proved to be extremely difficult, as each faction's commanders pursued their own tactical objectives, while paying insufficient attention to the overall strategic picture. Morgoth's defense of the capital demonstrated military genius that surprised even those who had known him for decades. His intimate knowledge of Landel's fortifications, combined with his ability to coordinate the various defensive systems that had been built up over centuries, allowed him to maximize the advantages that defensive warfare provided. But more importantly, his absolute conviction in the righteousness of his cause gave him a psychological advantage that his more conflicted opponents lacked. The use of tree avatars as living siege engines marked one of the most shocking developments of the entire war. These massive tree spirits, which had previously served only as guardians of minor trees, were somehow compelled or convinced to join the battle as active combatants. Their appearance on the battlefield created terror among both sides, as few had ever imagined that such ancient and revered beings could be drawn into mortal conflicts. The sight of Erdtree avatars attacking the walls of Landel, while defenders who had sworn to serve the Urgi fought desperately to repel them, created a symbolic crisis that went far beyond the immediate military situation. The Golden Order's claim to represent the will of the Erdtree itself was challenged in the most direct way possible, forcing both soldiers and civilians to question fundamental assumptions about the nature of divine authority. The psychological impact of this development extended throughout both armies, as soldiers on both sides found themselves wondering whether they were fighting for or against the true interests of the cosmic forces they claimed to serve. The religious certainties that had sustained many warriors through the earlier phases of the war began to crumble when faced with evidence that even the most sacred beings were divided in their loyalties. Morgoth's eventual victory in the first defense of Lendal came at enormous cost to both sides. The coalition forces were repelled, but not before inflicting damage on the capital that would take years to repair. More significantly, the revelation that the royal capital could be successfully assaulted, even if not captured, demonstrated that Morgoth's position was not as impregnable as it had appeared. The aftermath of the siege saw significant changes in the strategic calculations of all the major factions. The rebel coalition that had failed to take Lindell dissolved as its component factions blamed each other for the failure and began pursuing separate strategies that they hoped would prove more effective. The unity that had briefly existed between the various anti-orc was replaced by renewed competition and suspicion. Godric's response to the failure at Lendal was to launch his own independent campaign aimed at proving that he deserved recognition as the paramount leader of the rebel cause. His decision to assault Castle Redmine, one of Redden's major strongholds in Kidd, was motivated as much by personal pride as by strategic necessity. The psychological need to demonstrate his worthiness as a military commander overcame the tactical logic that suggested avoiding confrontation with the mightiest warrior among the demigods. The Battle of Castle Redmine became a showcase for the most disturbing aspects of Godric's transformation into the Grafted. His forces employed captured enemies in horrific experiments that created hybrid warriors, combining the worst aspects of different species and races. The sight of these abominations shambling across the battlefield created terror, was as effective as any conventional weapon, but also ensured that no quarter would be given by either side. Radahn's response to the assault on his stronghold revealed new dimensions of his growing instability. The constant strain of maintaining his cosmic barriers while participating in ground combat was beginning to affect his judgment and self-control. His use of gravity magic during the battle created devastating effects that went far beyond what was necessary to repel the attackers, suggesting that his noble restraint was beginning to crack under the pressure of ongoing warfare. The collateral damage inflicted during the Battle of Castle Redmine served as a preview of the environmental catastrophes that would characterize the later phases of the Shattering. The gravitational distortions created by Radahn's magic permanently altered the landscape around the castle, creating areas where the laws of physics operated according to different rules than those that governed the rest of the world. Godric's defeat at Castle Redmine was both military and personal, as his grafted enhancements proved inadequate against an opponent whose power operated on a fundamentally different level than conventional magic or physical prowess. The humiliation of being literally thrown from the battlefield by gravitational forces that he could neither understand nor counter drove him to even more desperate measures in subsequent campaigns. The retreat from Khalid marked the beginning of Godric's transformation from a legitimate claimant to the throne into something closer to a warlord whose primary goal was simple survival. His forces, reduced in number and morale by their defeat, began to adopt tactics that prioritize self-preservation over strategic objectives. The noble prince who had once commanded respect, if not affection, became a figure of fear and revulsion, whose very presence corrupted everything around him. Meanwhile, in the underground depths beneath Kid, Moog's blood dynasty was conducting its own campaigns that operated according to entirely different principles than the surface conflicts. The recruitment drives that brought new cultists into the dynasty's ranks were sustained through a combination of promises and threats that proved remarkably effective among populations that had been abandoned or betrayed by the surface world's authorities. The blood magic that sustained Moog's forces created military capabilities that conventional armies could not match or counter. Warriors who gained power through consuming the blood of their enemies became stronger with each victory, creating a positive feedback loop that made Moe's forces increasingly dangerous as the war progressed. But this advantage came at the cost of making his followers increasingly dependent upon continued violence and conquest. The expansion of the Blood Dynasty's territory through the underground tunnel systems created a hidden front in the Shattering that most surface observers were unaware of. The battles fought in these subterranean spaces were particularly brutal, as the confined environments amplified the effectiveness of blood magic, while making conventional military tactics impossible. The civilian populations caught in the areas where the Blood Dynasty was expanding faced choices that were universally terrible. Submission to Moog's rule meant participating in blood rituals that violated every moral principle they had been taught, while resistance meant facing warriors whose power grew with each person they killed. The psychological trauma inflicted on these communities created wounds that would persist long after the physical damage of war had been repaired. Miquella's campaigns during this period were characterized by their emphasis on defensive strategies and humanitarian objectives that set them apart from the purely military focus of other factions. The Hickers' forces operated with rules of engagement that prioritized the protection of civilians and the minimization of unnecessary casualties. Even when such restraint reduced their military effectiveness, the unalloyed gold technology that Miquella's followers employed created new possibilities for healing and restoration that had not existed during the early phases of the war. Their ability to halt the progression of various supernatural afflictions made them valuable allies for any faction willing to accept their terms, but also created complex political situations when their services were requested by multiple competing sides. The moral authority that Miquella's compassionate approach gave him was offset by the practical limitations it imposed on his military effectiveness. His refusal to employ the most destructive applications of his power meant that his forces were often unable to exploit victories or prevent retreats that allowed dangerous enemies to escape and regroup. The growing tension between Miquella's idealistic objectives and the brutal realities of the Shattering created internal conflicts within his faction that his enemies were quick to exploit. Some of his followers began to question whether their leader's unwillingness to use available power represented virtue or weakness, while others worried that their restraint was allowing greater atrocities to occur elsewhere. The kidnapping of Miquella from his protective cocoon at the Hick Tree represented the most shocking single event of this phase of the war, as it demonstrated that even the most secure locations could be penetrated by sufficiently determined and resourceful enemies. The operation that Mog conducted to abduct his half-brother required months of preparation, and the coordination of forces from both the surface and underground theaters of war. The psychological impact of Miquella's disappearance on his followers was catastrophic, as their entire worldview had been built around serving and protecting their beloved leader. The realization that they had failed in their most fundamental duty created a crisis of faith that paralyzed the Hickers' military forces at a crucial moment in the war. Molinia's response to her brother's kidnapping marked the beginning of her transformation from a disciplined warrior into the instrument of destruction that would ultimately devastate Ka. The rage and despair that consumed her when she learned of Miquella's fate broke down the careful self-control that had previously contained her affliction with Scarlet rot. The search for Miquella that Millennia launched involved some of the most destructive military operations of the entire war. As her forces swept across multiple regions, seeking any trace of where their leader might have been taken, the path of devastation that her army left in its wake served as a constant reminder of what happened when the restraint that normally governed her actions was removed by emotional trauma. The intelligence networks that had been built up by the various factions during the early phases of the war now became crucial assets in the search for Miquella and the broader struggle for strategic advantage. The ability to intercept enemy communications or plant false information became as important as conventional military strength in determining the outcome of campaigns. Rand's network of agents and allies proved to be particularly effective during this period, as their use of spirit summoning and undead servants allowed them to operate in areas where living agents would have been detected and eliminated. The information gathering capabilities that her forces possessed gave her significant advantages in planning operations and anticipating enemy movements. But the reliance on supernatural intelligence assets also created vulnerabilities that more conventional spy networks did not face. The magical signatures created by spirit summoning could be detected by enemy sorcerers, while the undead agents were vulnerable to specific types of magic that could disrupt their animating forces. The naval campaigns that developed during this period opened up new strategic possibilities as the various factions sought to control the waterways that connected different regions of the lands between. The magical vessels and floating fortresses that emerged from Academy research created new paradigms for maritime warfare that made traditional naval tactics obsolete. The transformation of Aeonia's lakes into contested zones had profound effects on the local ecosystem and the communities that depended upon aquatic resources for survival. The magical contamination that resulted from naval battles made large areas of water unusable for drinking or irrigation, forcing mass population movements that created additional humanitarian crisis. As this phase of the Shattering drew to a close, it became apparent that the strategic situation was becoming increasingly complex and unstable. No faction had achieved decisive advantages that would allow them to dominate their rivals, but the level of destruction and trauma that had been inflicted made any return to the pre-war status quo impossible. The stage was now set for the most devastating phase of the Shattering. As the various factions prepared for campaigns that would push their capabilities to the absolute limit, the restraints that had previously prevented the the use of the most destructive weapons and tactics were about to be abandoned entirely, as each side sought the breakthrough that would finally end the stalemate. Chapter 7. The Scarlet Devastation. The third year of the Shattering would be remembered as the time when the conflict transformed from a war between armies into a catastrophe that threatened the very habitability of the lands between. The escalation that had been building throughout the previous campaigns finally reached a breaking point when the two mightiest warriors among the demigods met in single combat on the plains of Kyla, unleashing forces that would forever change the nature of the world they were fighting to control. The Battle of Aeonia, as it would later be known, was the inevitable result of mounting tensions between Malenia and Radahn that had been building since the beginning of the war. Their rivalry was not personal in nature, for both respected each other's martial prowess and noble character. Rather, it emerged from the incompatible strategic objectives that their respective positions in the conflict required them to pursue. Radahn's role as the guardian who held back cosmic forces made him reluctant to commit his full strength to offensive operations, as doing so might weaken the barriers that protected the world from stellar catastrophes. This defensive mindset put him at odds with factions that required active military support to achieve their objectives, particularly those who viewed his neutrality as a form of passive opposition to their cause. Malenia's desperate search for her kidnapped brother had led her forces into Khalid on the basis of intelligence, suggesting that Moog's agents were operating in the region. While this information proved to be false, it brought her army into direct conflict with Radahn's forces at a time when her emotional state made diplomatic resolution impossible. The failure to locate any trace of Miquela in Khald created a psychological crisis for Malenia. That was compounded by her growing awareness that the scarlet rot within her was becoming increasingly difficult to control. The unalloyed gold needle that had previously helped contain her affliction had been damaged during earlier battles, reducing its effectiveness at the worst possible moment. The demands that Malenia's followers placed upon her to take decisive action, combined with her own guilt over failing to protect Miquela, created internal pressures that overcame her normally disciplined approach to warfare. The rational strategic thinking that had previously guided her campaigns was replaced by an emotional need to strike out against someone, anyone, who might be responsible for her brother's fate. Radahn's initial response to the invasion of Khalid was characteristically defensive, as he sought to minimize casualties while protecting the civilian populations caught between the opposing armies. His gravitational magic was employed primarily to create barriers and deflect attacks, rather than to inflict maximum damage on enemy forces. Reflecting his continued adherence to the noble principles that had shaped his character. But Malenia's forces were not conducting a conventional military campaign that could be resolved through defensive strategies alone. They were on a desperate mission that required them to search every possible hiding place and interrogate every potential source of information. The intensity of their search operations created conflicts that could not be avoided through strategic withdrawals or tactical maneuvering. The escalation from skirmishes to full-scale battle occurred gradually over several weeks, as both sides found themselves drawn deeper into a conflict that neither had originally wanted. The local commanders, who were trying to manage the situation on the ground, lacked the authority to make the kinds of political decisions that might have prevented the worst outcomes. The personal confrontation between Malenia and Radahn was triggered by a relatively minor incident involving the treatment of prisoners. But it represented the culmination of tensions that had been building since their forces first encountered each other. Both demigods understood that their reputations and their factions' credibility were now at stake in a way that made backing down impossible. The single combat that decided the Battle of Aeonia was unlike any confrontation that had occurred during the previous phases of the Shattering. Both participants possessed power that operated on a cosmic scale, making their duel as much a force of nature as a military engagement. The very ground beneath their feet was reshaped by the energies they released, while the air itself became difficult to breathe due to the magical forces that filled it. Radahn's gravitational magic allowed him to manipulate the battlefield itself, creating conditions that should have given him decisive advantages over any opponent. His ability to increase his own effective mass while reducing that of his enemies, combined with his skill at redirecting projectiles and area effect attacks, made him nearly invulnerable to conventional assault. But Malenia's combat style was specifically designed to overcome the kinds of defenses that Radahn employed. Her incredible speed and precision allowed her to exploit momentary gaps in his gravitational barriers, while her supernatural healing abilities meant that she could sustain damage that would have been fatal to any other opponent. The turning point in their duel came when Malenia's unalloyed gold needle was finally overwhelmed by the strain of containing her affliction during such intense combat. The scarlet rot that had been building up within her for years was suddenly released in a massive bloom that transformed the entire battlefield into a hellscape of disease and decay. The scarlet Aeonia that bloomed from Malenia's body was not merely a weapon, but a fundamental transformation of the natural order that governed the region. The rot that spread outward from the point of blooming converted everything it touched into extensions of itself, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of corruption that would continue long after the battle had ended. Radahn's response to the scarlet bloom demonstrated both his incredible resilience and the limitations of even divine power when confronted with forces that operated according to alien principles. His gravitational magic could deflect physical attacks and redirect energy weapons, but it provided no protection against a disease that infected the very air and soil around him. The sight of the mightiest warrior among the demigods being slowly consumed by scarlet rot created psychological trauma among the witnesses that went far beyond the immediate military implications of the battle. The realization that even Radahn could be brought low by forces beyond his control shattered assumptions about the nature of power and invincibility that had sustained many throughout the earlier phases of the war. The mutual destruction that resulted from the Battle of Aeonia represented the worst possible outcome for both sides. Millennia's forces achieved no meaningful strategic objectives, while losing their leader to an uncontrolled magical coma. Radahn's army was left without effective command, while their general was transformed into a mindless beast, driven only by hunger and rage. The environmental consequences of the Scarlet Bloom extended far beyond the immediate battlefield, as the rot began to spread through the ecosystem of Khalid in ways that threatened to make the entire region uninhabitable. Plants and animals that had never been exposed to such corruption began to mutate in ways that created new forms of life that were hostile to everything that had existed before. The transformation of Khalid from a thriving region into the festering wasteland, it would remain for generations served as a stark demonstration of what the Shattering was costing the lands between. The pursuit of political objectives through magical warfare was literally destroying the world that the various factions claimed they wanted to rule. The psychological impact of the Kid catastrophe reached every corner of the lands between, as reports of the devastation spread throughout the remaining population centers. The realization that the Demigods' conflicts could create permanent damage on such a scale led many to question whether any of them deserved to inherit the throne they were fighting over. The loss of both Millennia and Radahn as active participants in the Shattering fundamentally altered the strategic balance among the remaining factions. Two of the most powerful military forces had been effectively eliminated, but neither had been defeated in a way that benefited any of their rivals. The vacuum created by their mutual destruction opened up new possibilities for the surviving demigods while eliminating constraints that had previously limited their actions. Miquela's followers, deprived of both their leader and their primary military protector, found themselves in an untenable position that forced them to choose between dissolution and alliance with one of the remaining factions. The humanitarian principles that had guided their participation in the Shattering became impossible to maintain without the power to enforce them. The retreat of millennia's surviving forces to the Hickory marked the effective end of their faction as an independent military power. The Cleanrot Knights, who had served as the backbone of their army, were decimated both by losses sustained in Cade and by the scarlet rot that many had contracted during the battle. Those who survived were often too ill to continue fighting effectively. Radahn's transformation into a mindless beast, consumed by hunger for both flesh and combat, created a new kind of threat that was hostile to all factions equally. The festival that was eventually organized to put him out of his misery represented one of the few collaborative efforts undertaken by the various warring parties during the entire conflict. The changes that the Scarlet Rot wrought upon Khaled's ecosystem created new forms of life that would persist long after the war's end. The giant insects and mutated creatures that emerged from the corrupted landscape were not merely monsters, but representatives of an entirely different form of biological organization that operated according to principles that conventional life could not understand or coexist with. The humanitarian crisis created by the Cod catastrophe overwhelmed the capacity of any single faction to provide adequate relief. Refugee streams from the affected region spread the rot to new areas, while straining resources in communities that were already struggling to cope with the ongoing war. The breakdown of medical and magical healing systems meant that many who might have been saved died from diseases that had previously been easily treatable. The political consequences of the Battle of Aeonia extended beyond the immediate military situation to affect the fundamental legitimacy of the entire conflict. The demonstration that the Demigods' pursuit of power could create destruction on such a scale led many to conclude that none of them possess the wisdom or restraint necessary to serve as effective rulers. Music religious authorities, who had previously supported various factions, began to question whether the Shattering represented divine will or cosmic catastrophe. The corruption of Khaled, a region that had been blessed by the Urgi for centuries, seemed to contradict the fundamental assumptions upon which the Golden Order's theology was based. The economic impact of losing Khaled as a productive region created shortages and supply disruptions that affected all remaining factions. The trade routes that had connected different parts of the lands between were severed, while the agricultural and mineral resources that the region had provided were no longer available to support military operations or civilian needs. As news of the catastrophe spread beyond the lands between, it began to affect the realm's relationships with neighboring territories and distant trading partners. The reputation for stability and prosperity that had made the Golden Order an attractive ally was replaced by an image of a failed state, whose internal conflicts threatened to spread chaos to surrounding regions. The magical contamination that resulted from the Scarlet bloom created areas where normal spellcasting became unpredictable or impossible. The fundamental laws that governed magical energy were warped by the presence of alien corruption, making it dangerous for practitioners to employ techniques that had previously been reliable and safe. The long-term implications of the Khalid catastrophe would not become fully apparent until years later. But it was already clear that the Shattering had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return to the pre-war status quo. The world that emerged from the conflict, regardless of who ultimately claimed victory, would be fundamentally different from the one that had existed during the Golden Age. The stage was now set for the final phase of the Shattering, as the surviving factions prepared for a struggle that would determine not just who ruled the lands between, but whether anything worth ruling would remain when the fighting finally ended. Chapter 8: The Final Reckoning and the Age of Abandonment. The aftermath of the Khalid catastrophe marked the beginning of the end for the Shattering, as a conventional war between organized factions pursuing coherent political objectives. The mutual destruction of Millennia and Radahn had eliminated two of the most powerful military forces, while demonstrating that continued escalation threatened to make the entire lands between uninhabitable. Yet the remaining demigods, driven by the corrupting influence of their great runes and their own psychological inability to accept defeat, continued to pursue their ambitions, even as the world crumbled around them. The fourth and final year of the Shattering was characterized not by grand campaigns or decisive battles, but by a series of increasingly desperate gambits and atrocities that reflected the complete breakdown of any restraint or moral consideration. The noble ideals and family bonds that had once provided some limitation on the scope of destruction were abandoned entirely, replaced by a nihilistic pursuit of victory at any cost. Godric's final transformation into the grotesque creature he would remain exemplified this descent into madness and desperation. The defeats he had suffered at Lendel and Castle Redmine had stripped away any pretense that his cause represented something greater than his own hunger for power. The grafting experiments that had begun as attempts to strengthen himself became an obsession that consumed every aspect of his existence. The siege of Stormville Castle, which Godric had fortified as his final stronghold, became a horror that traumatized everyone who witnessed it. The prisoners that his forces captured were subjected to surgical procedures that violated every principle of human dignity, transformed into hybrid creatures that served as both weapons and symbols of their creator's madness. The sight of these abominations shambling across battlefields, while retaining enough of their original consciousness to plead for death, created psychological wounds among both attackers and defenders that would never heal. The realization that such fates awaited anyone captured by Godric's forces led to a complete breakdown in the conventions of warfare that had previously limited the scope of atrocities. Yet, even as Godric's forces committed these horrors, they found themselves increasingly isolated and desperate. The other factions had learned to avoid direct confrontation with his armies, choosing instead to contain them within Stormville, while focusing their attention on more manageable targets. The castle that had once been a symbol of noble strength became a prison whose occupants were more dangerous to each other than to their enemies. Moog's blood dynasty, meanwhile, had used the chaos created by the surface conflicts to expand its influence throughout the underground regions of the lands between. The recruitment drives that brought new cultists into the dynasty's ranks had been remarkably successful among populations that had been abandoned or betrayed by the surface world's authorities. The blood magic that sustained Moog's forces had evolved during the course of the war into something that barely resembled its original form. The rituals that empowered his followers now required levels of sacrifice and cruelty that would have been unimaginable during the early phases of the conflict. The dynasty's territory became a realm where conventional morality was not merely absent, but actively inverted. The forced elevation of Miquella to godhood through Moog's blasphemous rituals represented the culmination of plans that had been years in the making. The techniques employed to accelerate Miquella's divine transformation were drawn from forbidden knowledge that Moog had acquired through his worship of the Formless Mother, an outer god whose agenda was fundamentally hostile to all existing life. The psychological trauma that these procedures inflicted upon Miquella was not an unfortunate side effect, but a deliberate component of the ritual design. The outer god that Mog served drew power from suffering and corruption, making the violation of innocence and purity essential elements in any working that sought to channel its influence. The realization that Miquella had been transformed from the most compassionate of the demigods into a weapon. For an alien intelligence created despair among his surviving followers that went beyond mere political defeat. The destruction of everything he had represented symbolized the complete triumph of chaos over order, corruption over purity, and despair over hope. Reichard's experiments with serpent magic and blasphemous knowledge had meanwhile progressed to the point where he could no longer be considered the same being who had once served as Pritter of the Golden Order. His fusion with the Great Serpent was not merely physical, but spiritual, creating a hybrid consciousness that embodied the hunger and amorality of both its component parts. The Volcano Manor had become a center for research into forms of magic that violated the fundamental laws governing reality itself. The knowledge that Rayard scholars pursued was not merely forbidden, but actively dangerous to sanity and existence. drawn from sources that predated the current cosmic order and operated according to principles that were fundamentally hostile to life as it was commonly understood. The servants and followers who supported Reichard's research found themselves changed by their exposure to this blasphemous knowledge in ways that made return to normal existence impossible. The transformations they underwent were not merely physical, but ontological, altering their fundamental nature in ways that placed them outside the categories of existence that had previously defined the boundaries between life and death, order and chaos. The weapons and techniques that emerged from the volcano Mana's laboratories represented applications of power that should have been impossible within the cosmic framework established by the Elden Ring. The fact that they functioned at all demonstrated how thoroughly the Shattering had destabilized the laws that governed reality, creating opportunities for forces that had been suppressed since the beginning of recorded history. The alliance that eventually formed between Reichard and certain factions within Ronnie's network represented one of the most disturbing developments of the war's final phase. The shared opposition to the greater will and the golden order that brought these groups together created common cause between entities whose ultimate objectives were fundamentally incompatible. Rand's manipulation of this alliance demonstrated the extent to which her pursuit of freedom from divine influence had corrupted her own moral judgment. The willingness to employ weapons and allies that threatened the very existence of the world she claimed to want to liberate revealed contradictions in her philosophy that she either could not or would not acknowledge. The underground war that erupted between Moog's blood dynasty and the various factions allied with Reichard created a new front in the Shattering that was even more brutal and destructive than the surface conflicts. The confined spaces where these battles were fought amplified the effectiveness of the most horrific weapons, while making it impossible for non-combatants to escape the zones of destruction. The civilian populations caught in these underground conflicts faced choices that were universally terrible. Submission to either faction meant participating in rituals and practices that violated every moral principle they had been taught, while resistance meant facing opponents whose power grew stronger with each atrocity they committed. The collapse of the tunnel systems that connected different regions of the lands between severed communication and trade links that had existed for centuries. Communities that had depended upon these underground routes for survival found themselves isolated and unable to access the resources they needed to maintain their populations. Meanwhile, on the surface, Morgott's increasingly desperate defense of Lendl revealed the extent to which even the most stable remaining institution was beginning to crack under the pressure of ongoing warfare. The royal capital, which had seemed impregnable during the early phases of the conflict, now showed signs of the strain that years of siege and isolation had created. The breakdown of supply lines and trade networks meant that even the capital's extensive stockpiles were beginning to run low on essential commodities. The rationing systems that Morgott implemented to manage these shortages created new sources of social tension, while failing to address the underlying problems that made shortages inevitable. The religious crisis that developed within Lendl, as reports of the various atrocities reached the capital, created challenges that Morgott was particularly ill-equipped to handle. His absolute faith in the Golden Order made it impossible for him to acknowledge that the system he defended might be fundamentally flawed, while his status as an omen made it difficult for him to serve as a credible spokesperson for orthodox religious values. The prophecies and omens that began to manifest throughout the capital spoke of cosmic judgment and divine abandonment in language that could not be dismissed as mere superstition. The appearance of strange phenomena in the sky above Lendl, combined with the increasing frequency of supernatural events within the city itself, created an atmosphere of impending doom that affected both military effectiveness and civilian morale. The final siege of Lendl, when it came, was not the result of any coordinated strategy by the remaining rebel factions, but rather the inevitable consequence of the capital's isolation and the breakdown of all other sources of authority. The various forces that converged on the city represented less an army than a collection of desperate groups seeking whatever resources or salvation they could find. Morgott's last stand represented perhaps the noblest moment in the entire Shattering, as he fought to defend principles and institutions that had already been thoroughly discredited by the actions of those who claimed to serve them. His refusal to abandon his post, even when defeat became inevitable, demonstrated a loyalty that transcended rational calculation or personal interest. The fall of Lendl marked the effective end of the Golden Order as a functioning governmental system, though the symbolic importance of the throne would continue to drive conflicts for years to come. The royal capital that had once been the beating heart of a continental empire was reduced to a collection of ruins inhabited by scavengers and madmen. The imprisonment of Queen Marika within the tree had always been intended as a temporary measure that would end when order was restored and proper authority reestablished. But the complete breakdown of the cosmic hierarchy that the Shattering had created meant that no one possessed the power or legitimacy necessary to reverse the greater will's judgment. The abandonment that gave this period its name was not merely political, but cosmic in scope. The greater will, which had invested so much effort in establishing the Golden Order, finally concluded that the experiment had failed beyond any possibility of redemption. The withdrawal of divine support left the lands between to face the consequences of their choices without the safety net that had previously protected them from the worst outcomes. The Tarnished, those exiled warriors who had been stripped of grace and banished during Godfrey's reign, began to experience the return of divine blessing for the first time in generations. But this restoration came not as a reward for faithful service, but as a desperate measure by cosmic forces that had exhausted all other options for restoring stability to a broken world. The irony that salvation would come from those who had been cast out and rejected was not lost on the few scholars and priests who survived to witness these developments. The return of the Tarnished represented an acknowledgement that the pure and blessed had proven themselves incapable of maintaining the order they had inherited. The individual Tarnished who began to return to the lands between found a world that bore little resemblance to the one they had left. The golden prosperity of the previous age had been replaced by a landscape scarred by magical warfare and populated by creatures that had been twisted into forms that violated natural law. The task that awaited these returning exiles was not simply to claim a throne or restore a government, but to reconstruct the fundamental basis of existence itself. The Elden Ring that had given structure to reality lay shattered, its fragments scattered among beings who had proven themselves unworthy of the power they wielded. The great runes that had empowered the demigods throughout the Shattering now served as both the keys to ultimate power and the sources of corruption that had made such power dangerous. Any attempt to restore cosmic order would require not merely collecting these fragments, but somehow purifying them of the taint that their bearers had accumulated. The survivors of the Shattering, who remained in the lands between, represented a population that had been traumatized beyond any previous experience in recorded history. The social bonds and cultural institutions that had sustained civilization for centuries had been shattered as thoroughly as the Elden Ring itself, leaving individuals and communities to face an uncertain future with only the most basic survival instincts to guide them. The environmental damage that the war had inflicted upon the natural world created challenges that would persist for generations, regardless of what political settlements might be achieved. The regions that had been transformed by magical warfare would require centuries to heal, if healing was possible at all. The knowledge and wisdom that had been accumulated during the Golden Age was largely lost, either destroyed in the fighting or corrupted by contact with the blasphemous forces that several factions had employed. The libraries and armies that had preserved learning for centuries were reduced to ruins, their contents scattered or consumed by supernatural fires. The infrastructure that had supported trade and communication across the continental empire was broken beyond any possibility of quick repair. The roads and bridges that had connected different regions lay in ruins, while the magical systems that had supplemented conventional transportation were too dangerous to use due to the cosmic instabilities that the Shattering had created. Perhaps most tragically, the hope and idealism that had once inspired people to believe in the possibility of just government and wise leadership had been extinguished by years of witnessing the worst possible expressions of power and ambition. The cynicism and despair that characterized the post-Shattering population would prove to be among the most difficult wounds to heal. As the 4th year of the Shattering drew to a close, it became clear that the war had not ended through any victory or decisive resolution, but simply through the exhaustion of the participants' ability to continue fighting. The surviving demigods remained in their strongholds, still technically at war with each other, but no longer capable of meaningful military action. The silence that settled over the lands between was not the peace of resolution, but the quiet of desolation, broken only by the distant sounds of scavengers picking through the ruins of what had once been the greatest civilization the world had ever known. The Golden Age was over, and what would replace it remained a question that only the returning Tarnished could answer. Epilogue: The Legacy of Ruin. And so concludes our deep dive into the Shattering, the catastrophic civil war that transformed the lands between from a golden empire into the shattered realm that the Tarnished would eventually inherit. What began as a family dispute among demigods escalated into a cosmic catastrophe that challenged the very foundations of existence itself. The tragedy of the Shattering lies not merely in the destruction it caused, but in how thoroughly it revealed the contradictions and flaws that had always existed within the Golden Order's supposed perfection. The very attempt to banish death and impose eternal stability had created conditions that made such devastating conflict inevitable. When the cosmic dam finally broke, the flood that followed swept away everything that had seemed permanent and eternal. Each of the major participants in this drama was both victim and perpetrator, shaped by forces beyond their control, yet responsible for choices that multiplied suffering beyond measure. America's grief-driven shattering of the Elden Ring, Ranni's revolutionary conspiracy, the Demigods' subsequent war for dominance, all represented understandable responses to impossible situations that nonetheless created consequences far worse than the problems they sought to solve. The environmental and cultural devastation wrought by the Shattering would echo through the ages, creating the dark and dangerous world that players explore in Elden Ring itself. The twisted creatures, ruined landscapes, and broken societies all bear witness to what happens when divine power is turned to destructive ends without wisdom or restraint to guide it. Yet from this ultimate Nardia would eventually come renewal, as the returning Tarnished brought with them the possibility of learning from past mistakes and building something better from the ashes of the old order. Whether that potential was realized depended upon choices, yet to be made by those brave enough to take up the burden of rule in a world that had forgotten how to trust its leaders. The legacy of the Shattering continues to shape the lands between, a reminder that even gods can fall. That power without wisdom leads inevitably to ruin, and that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in fighting for what we think we deserve, but in working to heal the wounds that our conflicts have created. The epic tale of how the lands between fell apart teaches us that no order, however golden, is permanent when it fails to address the deeper needs and aspirations of those it governs. And perhaps most importantly, it shows us that even in our darkest hours, even when everything we believed in has crumbled to dust, the possibility of redemption and renewal remains, waiting for those bold enough to seize it. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of gaming's most devastating and complex conflicts. The story of the Shattering reminds us why we love these deep, intricate narratives that challenge us to think beyond simple tales of good versus evil. If you enjoyed this exploration of Elden Ring's tragic history, please like this video for more deep dives into gaming's greatest stories. Until next time, keep exploring those epic tales, fellow adventurers.